black people began in the United States when we were brought from Africa and sold as slaves. Once we arrived here, we were sold by Africans to the white people. Most of the white people were plantation owners. Their crops include tobacco, cotton, and indigo. Once the slaves arrived, they were inspected and looked over to see if there was any defects in them. That is the one that made it. Many that died on the slave ship because they were chained together with no little room to move. But most of them died from diseases. But once they were inspected, they were sold in a slave auction. Male slaves were often sold for a higher price than the female. The male slave would be the one that would work the long days and nights in the field. They were called the field slave and be under supervision of an overseer or sometimes the head inward in charge. Because of the beating from the master, the slave often feared for their lives and did what the master told them to do. Women worked in the field too, but some of the women were chosen to work inside the house. These were your house slaves. Because slaves were viewed as property rather than human beings, the house slaves often became mistresses to the master. This caused the mixing of the races, light-skinned and black people. That's where it all started. Most of the time, the husband of the slaves and the wives of the master weren't allowed to say or do anything about these. Some white women that could not bear children would pass off the kids fathered by the master as their own children. And most of the time, those kids would treat their own mother harshly as slaves because they did not know. But the mother, most of the mothers bear the pain anyway. Although some of the slaves thought this was a acceptable way of life, there were other slaves that thought otherwise. People like Nat Turner, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Tubman felt that they should be free as everybody else. Nat Turner led a slave revolt on the plantation in South Hampton County, Virginia, where he killed 50 white slave owners. But in repercussion, after they caught him, he was hung. Frederick Douglass was another slave abolitionist. He fought for the right of slaves through education. He was educated. He learned how to read because the master's wife taught him to read behind his back. Another prominent person is Harriet Tubman, who led over 700 slaves through the Underground Railroad. She was known as Moses because she never lost one slave. But it went until 1865 until Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation that freed the slaves after the Civil War. Most of the slaves did not know what to do with themselves. So most of them wound up sharecropping for the land on the former slave master. But when it came harvest time, the sharecropper would end up owing the landowner for money for supplies that they used before the harvest. The early 1900s through the 1960s saw some of the hardest and worst times for black people. Although we were free on paper, we were not actually free. We could not vote, we could not eat in public restaurants, we could not drink out of some of the water fountains. We had to sit in the color section of the theater and in the color section of the doctor's office. And our education at that time was secondary to our white counterparts. It was people like Andrew Young, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr. that led the fight for our civil rights. Martin Luther King Jr. became one of our most influential leaders at that time. He believed in a non-violent approach and didn't fight violence for violence. This method brought attention to the rest of the world to see the treatment of black people, especially in the South. Since the whole world could see what the government could see the treatment of the black people, the government had to take action. The Civil Rights Bill passed nearly 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights of 1968 were passed into law because of the early civil rights that lost their lives for us to have the same rights as the other people. One may ask why we need to know all of this. You don't know where you're going until you know where you've been. Today, there's no excuses for us to stand up to live to our future, to our potential. There's no more excuses for us not to get an education or to learn a trade. No more excuses for us for not to vote. And certainly no more excuse for us not to live the life that God had called us to live. So for as a people to go forward, we must stop hating each other and hurting each other with our mouth and with guns, and embrace each other with love, a love that is shown to us by God with His mercy and His grace. I say let's start today together and believe that we shall overcome, because thank God we are free, and we are free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.